This particular journey began for me in a room not much bigger than, well, kind of the piano down there. 2 bunk beds were in it, which 4 women who did not each know each other before all shared. Although there were thin walls, there was no ceiling overhead, so it was open to all the other rooms, maybe a total of 10 rooms, and it easily conducted some very loud snoring. This was the dormitory of Borderlinks, an educational nonprofit that provides immersion experiences around issues of migration to the U.S. Last November, I spent 6 days there, that was my room, with a group of 16 UU ministers and seminary students. We were in Tucson and Nogales, Mexico, and it was also co-sponsored by the UU College of Social Justice. People have asked me if I had a good time on this study leave. And although it was good, meaning worthwhile, it was a good experience, I would say that a better description would be that it was wrenching. And yet I had shelter. I had food. I had protection from the elements. The same night I began my time with Borderlinks, my then 22-year-old son Brian and his girlfriend were driving across the border to Hermosillo, Mexico. This was their first trip going together there by car. Brian had been a number of times by bus to visit her as she is finishing a degree in nursing at a Mexican university. He always emails when they are safely across the border, but it's coming back into the U.S. when I worry the most. So he also texts me when he arrives back on our side. The next one. I expected to feel sad viewing the graves of unknown border crossers, including a teenager whose bones were found on a ranch south of Tucson. These bones were sticking out of a pack rat nest, and if you look carefully, you can see that on the photo. I was sad, but I am not unfamiliar with death, and I did not cry, not then. The place was remote, lonely, beautiful, and hard to get there by foot. And yet I had good shoes. I had a water bottle. I had a hat. I could go home. It was heartbreaking to see the kitchen counter full of items found in the desert near the home of a couple who retired to the desert hoping for quiet beauty. They have unexpectedly developed a second career of finding and helping desert travelers and bearing witness to the suffering of people crossing through their backyard. The small baby shoe, the hand-embroidered cloth that probably once held homemade tortillas, the notebook full of English words someone was trying to learn. All these images are now imprinted in my mind. As you saw with the children, I've put similar objects from my own family on our altar here today to remind us of the human face of border crossers. Did that baby live? Did the hands that made those tortillas ever touch their loved one again? Did that traveler get to use the English words she was learning? So many memories. The huge wall itself. The kind hospitality of Manuel and his wife who fed us lunch, wanting only to show us how ordinary people live in Nogales. The memory of people slumped outside a Mexican police station, sent there by the Border Patrol, with no place to go, knowing no one. So many images, so many questions. All this has stayed with me from my Border Links journey. But do you know what it was that completely unglued me? It was watching 39 people be sentenced to 1 up to 6 months of jail time in the U.S., all in the span of 50 minutes in a federal courtroom in Tucson. They were all in shackles. They were mostly young men who looked just like my own sons, same age, mid-20s. This system is called Operation Streamline. What was their crime? They had avoided an official border inspection and crossed into the U.S. a second time. Although they wore headphones to hear a translation of the proceedings, it was clear many of them did not understand what was going on. In one fell swoop, they became felons and part of the narrative that allows both Democratic and Republican politicians to now say that over 60% of those illegally crossing into the U.S. are criminals. Most had been apprehended in the desert the previous day or two, and their feet were covered with blisters. They were jailed at U.S. taxpayer expense, and they may or may not receive medical treatment. I had known that U.S. immigration systems are broken and unfair. I have witnessed other injustice. I have witnessed poverty. I have been racked by grief myself. But I didn't know about Operation Streamline. Created originally as a deterrent for those crossing from Mexico into the U.S., it's now become a way for U.S. politicians to say they are tough on crime. The prisons these people are sent to have quotas, and we have to pay for them, whether they meet their quota or not. And they're now economically vital to many small rural towns and communities in the U.S., including Arizona. I was ashamed of my ignorance and of a U.S. court that mocked values of freedom and justice. Afterwards, I could not stop sobbing. I became unglued. Before we attended the Border Links immersion experience, we were asked to read some history about border issues and migration, especially along the U.S.-Mexican border. We learned more about border history also from several different speakers when we were at Border Links. The historical lands of Native peoples have included both sides of what is now the border, and individuals, families, clan groups have moved freely across those borders for centuries. There is nothing natural about these international borders. But what has become seemingly natural in the last century, or maybe even longer, is the pattern of attraction and then repulsion of Mexican workers into the U.S. When times are good, we need workers, and so we want them in. And when we don't need them, we push them back. They answered our call and followed the rules of capitalism. There are now over 11 million undocumented people in the U.S. The vast majority of them pay taxes and contribute to our economy. but they're subject to being detained at any time, separated from their families, sometimes imprisoned in poor conditions without due process, the due process that is allowed U.S. citizens. In 1994 and 95, as far as anyone can tell, there were no deaths of migrants in the Arizona deserts. No deaths. But this soon changed for several reasons. The NAFTA agreement pushed people off what had once been communal land. When asked why they then came here, many migrants answered, "My children were always hungry and I had to do something." Another reason, violence in Central America increasing, often made worse by U.S. policies, made even more people desperate to find safety somewhere. And then after September 11th, and for good reasons, Homeland Security took on increased importance here. For good reasons. Walls were built. Border Patrol personnel expanded. But broad measures taken to address some real threats have hurt many non-threatening people. The old migration crossings that were mostly through California and Texas were effectively closed off, and the more dangerous Arizona desert crossings became the main route. Private prisons grew. Then Operation Streamline began in 2005. We've allowed the narrative to change. As I mentioned before, at first only 10% of border crosses had criminal records. Now it's over 60% because we've made crossing a second time a felony. Instead of having criminals, we have criminalized migration. We've built a war zone. We have just the opposite of security. It's easy to become despairing of what has happened on our border. It's just as easy to be distracted by our own daily cares in our own lives. But my journey at Border Links made me have to keep my heart open and my eyes wide open. Primarily an educational organization, Border Links also has strong ties to local community organizations. We heard many, many stories told from the heart by people with firsthand experience working with groups such as Alliance for Global Justice, No More Deaths, United We Dream, and sometimes just people on their own doing what they could to help people. Often we don't know what we can do to make a difference. But what these storytellers asked was for us to share our own stories. Learn who our neighbors are. Don't tell other people's stories for them, but go out of our way to listen to other stories. Learn our history. Become educated. Speak up. Don't turn away from painful images and uncomfortable questions. Support community policing as a model. Vote. Pay attention. Read books together. Watch powerful movies. Talk together about difficult subjects. Elect local leaders who care. Use social media to change the narrative. Don't allow the poisoning of the political narrative. This church has already done several things that make a difference. You've given me the opportunity to learn and grow through study leave time, which allowed me to go to Border Links, and now to share some of that with you. Our social action ministry sponsored a forum last February on the intersections of race and poverty in Arizona. In May, many of you came out to our sock hop, and some contributed socks. which we gave to No More Deaths in Tucson, and some money that went to Center for Neighborhood Leadership in Phoenix. The UU School of Social Justice that sponsored my trip to Border Links continues to offer other immersion programs. In the summer, they have programs for high school students. During the year, groups from whole churches can go and do an experience together. So my son Brian just got back from Europe, where on a beach in Barcelona, he asked his girlfriend to marry him. Sometime soon he will move to Mexico as they start their new journey together. I pray that their border crossings remain safe and that they can always travel, live, and stay together. The border is so much closer than we realize. Let's keep our hearts and our eyes wide open. In the desert, human remains can disappear within 2 weeks. No trace. Our Unitarian Universalist first principle calls us to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And our second principle calls for justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. We don't get a pass from the hard questions and disturbing images. What would you do if you had to be separated from your children? Death by policy is something we can't continue to ignore.
No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well.
Your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in their throats. The boy you went to school with, who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory, is holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay.
No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under feet. Hot blood in your belly? It's not something you ever thought of doing until the blade burnt threats into your neck. And even then, you carried the anthem under your breath. Only tearing up your passport in airport toilets, sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear that you wouldn't be going back.
You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one burns their palms under trains or beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled mean something more than journey. No one crawls under fences. No one wants to be beaten or pitied.
No one chooses refugee camps or strip searches where your body is left aching, or prison, because prison is safer than a city of fire, and one prison guard in the night is better than a truckload of men who look like your father. No one could take it. No one could stomach it. No one's skin would be tough enough.
No one leaves home until home is a sweaty voice in your ear, saying, "Leave. Run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but I know that anywhere is safer than here."
Amen. So be it.